Now we're going to get started here on this sermon. We're continuing on with half-truths, and as I realized I only have this Saturday and the following Saturday here, I realized I'm not going to finish this book before I leave because, like I said, I thought I had 3 weeks and I only have 2. So we'll come back after I get home and do the last chapter of this one because I want to really get to the last chapter. And so, but this week, let's just kind of review a little bit. This is a book by Adam Hamilton that we've been looking at, and what it looks at is those sayings that, as Christians, that we sometimes use that sound really biblical and very Christian, but in many ways they really miss the point. They're not exactly 100% true. And a couple weeks ago we looked at this one, everything happens for a reason. And then last week we looked at God helps those who helps themselves. Man. Yeah, and those who know grammar as well. So God helps them who helps themselves. We looked at those two, and what we realized in those is they're partially true. You know, it's partially true when you look at everything happens for a reason. That's true if you look at, kind of the way that, consequences and things happen, cause and effect. That is definitely something that is real in this world. But as far as this idea that God is moving us around on this big chessboard. I like that song. Moving us around on a big chessboard, and we're just kind of standing there waiting for him to move us around, and that we're robots, and that God is, doing all these things kind of behind the scenes without us having any kind of choice about it. That's just not true. It may be partially true. It's not completely true. And so when we say those kind of things, our theology, our lack of theology kind of shows through. And then last week we talked about this idea of God helps those who help themselves, which again is partially true. Yes, that is partially true. But on the other side of that, God helps those who cannot help themselves. That is who our God is that He is looking to help those who have no way of helping themselves, whether that be because of physical issues or because of mental issues or because of poverty or whatever. There are some people who really can't help themselves. And maybe none of us fall into that category unless we fall off my sister's porch and break our ankle in 3 places. But all of us spiritually cannot help ourselves at all. We have no way of helping ourselves, and so thank God that He helps those who cannot help themselves. That's what grace is, and that's something that all of us have the opportunity to experience. And so these are partially true, but not completely true. Not 100% true by any means, and we have to be really careful with our words. And that's what you see it all the time. People throw these things on like Facebook and places like that look really good. I saw that eye roll, Vicki. Yep, I feel the same way. And these statements that kind of sound Christian, like we're talking about, and they really can do some damage because they're not 100% true. And we end up looking silly at times and ignorant at times. But even beyond that, no one wants to look that way. But even beyond that, we can also, by saying some of these things, we can turn people away from God because they realize in their lives that hasn't been 100% true. So we have to be careful with our words. Now this week, here's the one that we're going to look at this week. God won't give you more than you can handle. Anyone ever said that one before? Worse than that, has anyone ever said that to you in the midst of the deepest, up to here with stuff that does not smell very good, and somebody comes up to you and says, don't worry, you won't be completely covered up by that stuff because God won't give you more than you can handle. And what do you want to do? You just want to start throwing that stuff at them, right? This is one of those phrases that, again, sounds really Christian, but it's just not very helpful in the midst of trouble, in the midst of stuff. And it's just not really true. It's not very theologically sound. We use this when we say these things. We use it as an encouragement, right? Whenever we say these or somebody says it to you, they have the best intentions. They have the best intentions of trying to encourage you in the midst of whatever kind of problem that you're dealing with, whatever kind of trial you're going through, whatever situation that's hard to handle. They're trying to encourage, and they have the best intentions. But the whole truth of this, again, leads to poor theology. And poor, and just kind of not really caring that much. And so we want to kind of dig into this. Where did it come from? How on earth did this become part of our Christianese vocabulary? Where did this phrase come from? And what is true and what is not true about this? And in order to do that, we need to look at 1 Corinthians 10:13. And this may be one of those scriptures that you memorized if you were in Awanas or GAs or RAs. Anyone remember those things? Yeah? No? Two of them, well, all three of them are Baptists, so never mind. I memorized this verse when I was in Awanas, and let me tell you, Awanas was not my thing because it was all about becoming an Awana princess, and I was like, do I look like an Awana princess? Because you have to memorize enough. Anyway, there are Awanas programs in this town, and they're good, but it just didn't do anything for me because I just had no desire to be an Awana princess. But I did learn this verse. 1 Corinthians 10:13, and this is what it says. You probably have heard this. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. And so when you read this verse, you can kind of see where this idea comes that God's not going to give you more than you can handle. But the basis of this, the basis of the idea of that phrase, and how people have kind of taken this particular verse and said, okay, this means this, is completely based on this one word. The basis of God will not give you more than you can handle rests on the Greek word paraemesius. Yes, that's the way you pronounce that. And so, if my Greek is any good anymore, but yeah, this one word and what it means in Greek, and here's the problem, it can mean several things. It means any of these three interpretations. It can mean temptation, which is the way it is interpreted in most of your scriptures and most interpretations of the Bible, so it's going to be interpreted as temptation, but some of your versions will interpret it as trials or testing, okay? And when you look at the phrase, God won't give you more than you can handle, people who want to use this as their scriptural basis would interpret that as trials or testing. But which one is it? I mean, how can we know which one is it? Because they're not the same thing, are they? A temptation can be a trial, but a trial is not necessarily a temptation. And so it's one of those, if Janet were here, if she were not back taking care of my kids, she would tell me mathematically what that is. I can't remember if it's conversive or something like that, but it goes one direction, but it doesn't necessarily go that other direction. Anyone know?
Conditional.
What is it? Conditional? Oh, see? Daughter of Janet Hunter knows this. Well done. So it goes one way. A temptation can be a trial, but it's not. A trial is not necessarily a temptation. A trial is, or a testing is something that happens when we're going through a medical issue, or we're dealing with moving, or we are dealing with an injury, or we've dealt with a death in the family, or, there's all sorts of things that come up, but temptation is a very different thing. So what exactly was Paul talking about in this verse in 1 Corinthians? If we're going to figure that out, we have to look at the context. You have to look at the context to know exactly what he was talking about. And so the context of this whole passage and this whole book, in fact, is in the fact that Corinth was a crossroads city, okay? It was one of those cities that if you're in Corinth, you could go any direction on a major, either highway or seaway. It had a port, and when you got into the city, you could either go north or south on a major road, or you could go east on a major road. If you needed to go west, you could hop on a boat and go west. And so it was a crossroads city. And there were a lot of different cultures, and there were a lot of different religions, and there were a lot of different languages, and there were a lot of different gods, and there were a lot of different people that were all in Corinth because it was a business center. Think New York City, okay? It was a melting pot. It was somewhere where you could hear this language over here and this language over here. You could go to this temple over here. You could go to this temple over here. It was this melting pot of people in Corinth. And you could find anything you were looking for in Corinth. Whatever you were looking for, you could find it. When I say anything, I mean anything. Anything that you wanted, you could find. And there was a phrase that was used to describe Corinthians at the time that this letter would have been written, and it was to live like a Corinthian. And what that meant was that it was associated with drunkenness and sexual license. If you were living like a Corinthian, what the statement was saying is the people in Corinth, they like to party, okay? The people in Corinth like to party, and you can find anything you want, whatever direction of party you like, whatever kind of, anything, any kind of behavior you want to participate in, you can find it. You can find it there. You can find whatever you want. And so the church of Corinth was filled with people who had colorful pasts. Let me tell you, I would have loved to have been the pastor of this place because you know how I am. I like me some people with some stories. And so the people in Corinth, they had some colorful pasts. They had come out of all sorts of different things, different cultures, different languages, different religions, different areas of the world, and they brought all of their interesting stuff into this church in Corinth. What an awesome place to be. But kind of a hard place to be as well, right? Because temptation was on every corner. There was also this reputation in Corinth that pretty much on every block there was a temple to a different god. It was an area that had all of these temples. And so when you read the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul takes a lot of time to talk about all of the issues that the Corinthians had once had and said, don't go back to those things. And a lot of those things had to do with the fact that there was a different kind of pagan god on every corner. It was everywhere. And a lot of the sin in Corinth had to do with their religions. Now let me explain this because this comes up a lot. It's a very hot topic right now. Worship for pagans. Worship in a lot of these pagan temples had to do with drunkenness and indulging yourselves and sex. That's the way a lot of the pagans would worship. And so here's what would happen in a lot of them. There might be offerings of wine that you would give to certain gods. There might be offerings of like feast times that you would give to certain gods. But there were other gods who demanded that you connect with them sexually. And the way that you did that was with a temple prostitute. There was prostitutes in all of the temples. If it was a male god, there would be male prostitutes. And if it was a female god, there would be female prostitutes. And that's the way you connected with that particular god, is by going in and taking part in the services, I won't get too graphic here, in the services of the particular prostitute. So if you were a male and you worshiped this particular male god, you walked in and you took part in the services with a male prostitute. And vice versa, okay? So you can understand with that context where Paul in 1 Corinthians is talking about to the Corinthians, hey, don't participate in that anymore. And he uses the H word. But what he was talking about, y'all know the H word, right?
Yeah.
Not hell, homosexual. That's the word. He's saying, hey, don't go down to those temples anymore. Don't go down to those temples anymore. That's what he was talking about when he said, hey, this sexual activity that you've been engaging in, don't go back to those temples and do that stuff. Don't go and worship other gods like that. Just wanted to make that clear. But temptation was on every corner because there literally was a temple pretty much on every corner. And the things that happened in those temples were bad news. So, Paul stresses earlier, if you go back in chapter 10, the way that he kind of says, in even more context, how we know what he was talking about with this Greek word, paramisios, is that in earlier chapter 10, he's talking to them and saying, listen, I know you've got colorful pasts. I know there's temptation on every corner. I know that there's just all sorts of ways for you to get back into this idol worship and into this sexual pleasure and all of this drunkenness and all this kind of stuff. And you may think you're special. You're not so special. You're not so special. Because guess what? Temptation's not new. And so in the first part of chapter 10, he's talking to them about how It's not new. You're not the first people to deal with this temptation. And he says, and he tells the story, he says, listen, even the people of God were tempted in the same ways that you were. And it's not because they lived in a town with a bunch of different cultures. It's because when they came out of Egypt, as they were traveling along, they ran into a bunch of different cultures. And so they were then faced with all of these temptations to worship these other gods and to take part in all of this other idol worship and to do things their own way. And so he's saying, you guys aren't special. This is not new. Temptation is not new. Even all of these many ways that you can be tempted, it's not new. The people of Israel were tempted in the same way. So don't think that you're special in all of this. And so when we look at this whole bulk of context talking about all the temptation that was in Corinth, and the fact that earlier in the same chapter, Paul is referring to the temptations that the Israelites had, I think we have to say that the context of 13 is not about trials, it's about temptation. Okay? So this whole idea that this verse says, in essence, God won't give you more than you can handle, not exactly true. But the good news of this passage, if you want to just look at this passage standing on its own, and if it talks about temptation, the good news is that God provides a way. Yes, there is temptation. Yes, no temptation is new, Corinthians. You're not special. You don't have new magical ways to sin. All of these things have been around for a long time. But the good news is that God's going to provide you a way out. God's going to give you an escape. There's always an escape from temptation. Whatever comes your way, there's a way to resist it. There's a way to get out of it. Here's the bad news. You have to choose it. You have to choose it because everything doesn't happen for a reason and God doesn't move us around on this chessboard. There's a way of escape, but there's also a lot of ways in. There's a lot of ways out. There's a couple ways out. There's a lot of ways in. And you have to choose the way out. Now, we don't always do that, do we? It'd be nice if, every time we were faced with a temptation and we know, okay, here's the way out. Don't go in there. Don't do that. Don't do that. Stay away from that area. All those kind of things. Here's your road out. It'd be nice if we automatically chose that, wouldn't it? But a lot of times we end up choosing these over here. Now, we can't blame God for that, can we? We can't blame God for that. We chose. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. And, choices, they have consequences, and it's our responsibility to choose. But the other truth about this verse that I think is really important for us to talk about is that God doesn't give us our temptation. He doesn't give us our temptation. God is not the one that gives us temptation. He is not the one saying, all right, here you go. Let's see how you handle this one. Here you go. I'm going to put you in front of this particular choice and just to see what you do, just for sport, just to kind of see, I got a little bet over here, with Gabriel or whatever on what you're going to do. He's not the one that gives us our temptation. We do that pretty well on our own, I think. We walk into temptation really well on our own. We don't really need anybody to give it to us. Sometimes the people who we hang out with maybe kind of give it to us, but we do just fine on our own. God doesn't give it to us. He's not the one. He allows us to be tempted, but he's not the one that causes it to happen. And James in chapter 1, verse 13, he says, not only is God not tempted, but he doesn't tempt us. He's not the one. And why do I even bring that up? Well, remember what this phrase is we're talking about. God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Once again, can't be talking about temptation in that verse. Must be talking about trials. So even if we ignore the context of this verse and still want to say, no, it's talking about trials, there's still a big problem there because God does not give us temptation. And again, going back to this whole idea of God's responsibility here, if God is giving us these things, if he's giving us these trials, is that the way God works? If we talked about about this the first week. If we say that everything happens for a reason, then that has to be the good and the bad. Does God give us the bad? Not the God that I know. He's not a God of that. And that doesn't mean that things don't happen. That doesn't mean that things don't happen to us in the midst. I mean, obviously, we spent a little time tonight talking about some things that have happened to us. But God's not responsible for those things. He can work through those things, for sure, but He's not responsible for those things. So this whole idea that God gives us those things, no, not scriptural, not accurate, not theologically sound. But that doesn't mean that we won't go through them. Yes, obviously, we'll go through them. Lyme disease is no fun. Have had to go through it. Breaking your ankle is no fun. You had to go through it. Dealing with relationship issues, no fun. But all of us have been through it. Dealing with doctors and medical stuff, no, it's no fun. We've all experienced death probably at some point in our lives. It's no fun. It happens. We can't avoid it. But the good news here again is that God doesn't promise that we won't go through these things, but the scriptures do promise that God's going to walk with us in the midst of those hard times. In the midst of whatever God allows to happen or we walk into or we stumble into. Sorry, that's a bad pun, Stephanie. Sorry about that. Whatever happens and we find ourselves in the midst of trouble, it's not so much that God's not going to give us more than we can handle, because I don't know about you, there's been some times when I couldn't handle it. But God was there to help me handle it. And Christian family was there to help me handle it. Couldn't handle it on my own. But there were people there. And God was there in the midst of those hard times. So sometimes things happen, not because God's doing it to us, but sometimes there are things that we get that we can't handle. And that's kind of where God and the church comes in. And thank God for it. Because we need each other. We need God. So what does this all have to do with me? Well, here's the thing. Again, be careful. Be careful how you use these phrases, because I don't know that there's any truth in this one. This one's not, last week we talked about how the one that we looked at was 1/3 true and 2/3 false. And the one before that was kind of half true and half false. This one, there's not a whole lot in it that's true. God doesn't give us this stuff, and sometimes the stuff is more than we can handle. And there's no promise in the scriptures that says, that God's not going to allow things to happen that are going to be hard. So be careful how you use this phrase. It might be one that we just need to eliminate completely from our vocabulary. But in your own hard times, when things are out of control and it just feels like you can't handle it, know that this phrase isn't true. I think there are a lot of Christians out there who, in the midst of hard times, when they can't handle it and they think, oh my goodness, I've done something wrong, because it says God's going to not give me more than I can handle, and I can't handle this, so I must be doing something wrong. It's just not true. Maybe you need to reach out to some people. Maybe you need to rely more on God. But the truth is, we often get more than we can endure. And that's when we need to rely on each other and on God. And then beyond that, what does this have to do with me? Well, when you're helping others through hard times, again, don't use this phrase. Don't use this phrase. People need more than our little phrases, don't they? They need more than our just little trite, little things that we say when really, we need to do something a little bit more, but it's just easier to try to say. And again, with good intentions. With good intentions. But people need more than just little sound bites. And our words can either turn people towards God or they can turn them away from God. And in reading the book, Adam lists several examples where people have heard this in a time of crisis and it's turned them away from God. But on the other side of that, Stephanie, I'm going to use you as an example, if that's okay. I've kind of been picking on you tonight. Kind of, yeah. And you showed up anyway. Way to go. And I think it was Brandy that was telling me this. We were providing meals and things like that to Stephanie because, she couldn't handle it. And, Haley was out of town and she was back home pretty much living by herself. She had people coming in and helping. But we were like, we need to do a little bit more. And Brandy told me that Michelle was like, wow, so impressed with the way that this church took care of her. Our words and our actions can turn people to God, or they can turn them away from God. Stephanie found herself in a situation that she couldn't handle. And so you guys stepped in. That's the way it's supposed to work. And because of that, somebody else saw what the church is really about. And what God is about.
She didn't even think people did that.
Yeah. It's important, guys. People need more than our little phrases. They need us to be the hands and feet of Jesus. They need us to be God with skin on. And we need to just get rid of that phrase. It's just not true. So, whether you're in the midst of something right now, or if you're trying to help walk somebody else through the midst of something, do it with great care. I think we've said this every week. Because we're responsible for these things. We want to turn people towards God instead of away from Him. Let's pray together.